The silence inside the Hall of Relics was the kind that had weight to it. Serena Voss had learned, over the course of 23 years of living inside Boreal Clan's vast northern stronghold, that silence was never truly empty. It was always filled with something, with the memory of sounds that had stopped too suddenly, with the breath held by people who did not want to be noticed, with the particular pressure of being the only person in a room who did not belong there. She had become an expert at reading silence. It was one of the few skills that living among wolves, without being one, had given her freely. She set her cleaning cloth against the base of the obsidian shelf and let her eyes travel across the room in the slow, methodical way she had developed over years of solitary mornings. The artifacts rested in their places, undisturbed. The ceremonial goblets from the Third Era, the fang-marked treaty scrolls sealed in their glass casings, the woven battle banners from the War of the Pale Moon. All of them exactly where they were supposed to be. All of them exactly as they had always been. And then there was the wolf. The ice wolf of the north stood at the center of the hall on its raised dais of black stone, carved from a single block of glacier ice so ancient that scholars had stopped trying to date it and simply recorded it as existing before the founding of any known clan. It stood nearly as tall as Serena herself, its body captured mid-stride in a posture of absolute authority, head slightly lowered, ears forward, eyes open and pale as winter sky. And it never melted. Not in summer, not when the great hearth fires burned through the hall on ceremonial nights. Not even when the war torches had been lit during the border conflicts 3 years ago, and the heat had been so intense that the stone walls themselves had wept with condensation. The wolf simply existed, as cold and unchanged as the day it had presumably been carved, though no one knew by whom, or when, or why. The scholars called it an anomaly. The elders called it sacred. The other members of the clan called it untouchable, because it was. Any wolf who pressed their palm against the glacier surface came away with burns. Not heat burns, but cold burns, the kind that left the skin pale and numb for days. Serena had watched Alpha Jarek, the leader of the Boreal clan, attempt to touch it once when she was 12 years old, during some kind of official assessment of the clan's relics. He had pulled his hand back with a sound she had never heard from an alpha before. A hiss of genuine pain. He had not tried again. Serena touched the wolf every morning. She had been doing it since she was 5 years old, and had wandered into the hall alone for the first time, before anyone had told her she was not supposed to be there. She remembered reaching out with the pure curiosity of a child who had not yet learned to be afraid, pressing both small palms flat against the glacier surface, and feeling nothing but a pleasant coolness, the way a stone feels in autumn, not threatening, not burning, simply present. She had not understood at 5 that this was unusual. By the time she understood, it had become routine, and she had learned, with the particular wisdom of a child who survives by being overlooked, that the safest secrets were the ones you simply never mentioned. So she touched the wolf every morning. She pressed her hand flat against its flank, felt the familiar deep cold travel up through her palm and into her wrist like a greeting, and she stood there for a moment in the quiet hall before the rest of the stronghold woke, and filled with noise and hierarchy, and all the complicated business of being a clan of wolves who barely tolerated a human among them. This particular morning, the cold felt different. She noticed it the moment her skin made contact, a vibration beneath the surface of the ice she had never felt before, subtle as a heartbeat but unmistakably. There, a pulse of something that moved through the glacier body of the carved wolf, and into her hand and up her arm, and settled somewhere in the center of her chest, with a warmth that had no business existing inside something made of ancient ice. Serena went very still. She stood with her palm flat against the wolf's flank, and breathed slowly, and waited to see if the sensation would pass. It did not pass. It deepened. And then, so gradually she thought at first she was imagining it, the wolf's pale carved eyes began to glow. It was not a dramatic light. It was not the blinding flash of a supernatural event. in one of the old stories the clan elders told during winter ceremonies. It was subtle and low and cold blue, like bioluminescence trapped inside deep ice, like the particular quality of light that exists just before dawn in a landscape covered entirely by snow. It moved through the body of the wolf from the eyes down through the chest and into the base of the dais, and Serena watched it travel with her hand still pressed against the flank and her breath entirely suspended, and she had the inexplicable sensation of being recognized. Not seen, not noticed, recognized. The way you might feel when someone says your name in a room full of strangers and uses a tone of voice that makes clear they have been waiting specifically for you. The light reached the base of the dais and pooled there, and in that pooled light, letters began to form. Not carved, not etched, but emerging from within the ice, as if they had always been there and were simply now choosing to become visible. She had to crouch to read them. The language was old, older than the common tongue used across the clans. But Serena had spent 23 years in a hall of relics, and she had read everything in it, including the language primers among the archived scholarly texts. She was slow and careful, moving her eyes across each character, and by the time she had reached the end of the inscription, her hands were shaking. She read it 3 times. The 3rd time she read it, she sat down on the cold stone floor of the hall and pressed her back against the dais and stared at the ceiling and tried to remember how to breathe normally. The inscription said, "She who is born of 2 worlds and claimed by neither shall be the hand that wakes the guardian. The guardian chooses its queen before the king knows her name. Blood of the lost line, ice in her veins, fire in her silence." The bond was written before the first Alpha drew breath. What the glacier remembers, no crown can undo. She read that last line twice. If you are enjoying this story, do not forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like this one. Serena was still sitting on the floor when the doors of the Hall of Relics opened, and Mara, the head of the domestic staff, leaned in with the expression she reserved specifically for Serena, a mixture of impatience and contempt that communicated, without words, the full complexity of Mara's position on the subject of humans living among wolves. "The king's delegation arrives at midday," Mara said. "Alpha Garrick wants every Relics Hall presentable and every household staff member at their post by the 11th hour. That includes you." She looked at Serena on the floor with an expression suggesting she found the sight confirming of something she had always suspected. "What are you doing down there?" "Resting," Serena said, which was technically true, and invited no further questions. Mara made a sound communicating her opinion of humans, who rested on stone floors, and pulled the door shut. Serena got to her feet slowly. She pressed her palm once more against the wolf's flank, felt the pulse still there, steady as a second heartbeat, and then she stepped back and looked at the inscription still glowing softly in the base of the dais. She had perhaps 3 hours before the hall would fill with people preparing for the royal delegation's arrival. She needed to think. She needed to be very careful. She had spent her entire life inside this stronghold being very careful, and she understood, with a certainty that had the texture of the cold, she still felt moving through her palm, that whatever the wolf had just shown her, whatever the inscription meant, she could not allow anyone to see it before she understood it herself. She crossed to the supply cabinet on the far wall, retrieved her cleaning supplies, and began her morning work with the methodical calm of someone whose survival had always depended on appearing unremarkable. Alpha King Kylam Draven arrived exactly at midday, which was itself a kind of statement. Most visiting dignitaries arrived early to demonstrate eagerness or late to demonstrate power. Kylam Draven arrived at the precise appointed hour because he operated on a schedule that recognized neither eagerness nor the need for power games. He was already the most powerful man in the Northern Territories. He had nothing to prove with his timing. Serena watched the arrival from the upper gallery of the Stronghold's main hall, which was technically not a position she was supposed to occupy during official arrivals, but which offered an excellent view, and which no one had ever thought to forbid her from using, because it had never occurred to anyone that she would be interested enough to watch. This was, she had found, one of the quiet advantages of being consistently underestimated. He was taller than she had expected. She had heard descriptions of Calum Draven for years, the way everyone in the Northern Territories had heard descriptions of him, as something vast and inevitable, and best understood from a safe distance. Dark hair, pale eyes, a jaw carved with the intention of communicating permanent authority. All of that matched. What the descriptions had not captured was the way he moved, with the quality of stillness and motion that she herself had, developed by necessity, the ability to take up exactly as much space as needed and no more, and yet carry such density of presence that the room rearranged itself around him anyway. He was flanked by 4 guards and his chief advisor, Elder Soren, a gray-haired wolf whose expression suggested he had seen every political performance the world had to offer and been unimpressed by all of them. Alpha Garrick met them at the great doors with his daughter on his arm. Isolde Garrick was, by any reasonable measure, extraordinary to look at. Dark golden hair elaborately arranged in northern aristocratic style, eyes of rich amber that caught light in a way that seemed almost calculated. She wore white, bold against the gray stone of the stronghold, and wore the particular smile of someone who had rehearsed it long enough that it no longer felt like performance. She was also, in Serena's private assessment, one of the most deliberately cruel people she had ever encountered, with the specific cruelty of someone who understands exactly where other people are vulnerable and files that information away with the patience of a wolf waiting outside a den. She had been kind to Serena precisely once in 23 years, on the morning after Serena's adoptive father had died, and even then the kindness had felt like something being stored for future use. Serena watched her take Calum Draven's hand with the practiced grace of someone who had been preparing for this moment for years and thought, he has no idea what he is walking into. The formal reception that followed was the kind of event that Serena navigated with the ease of long practice, moving through the edges of the room with a tray of ceremonial wine cups and the expression of polite invisibility that had served her so well for so long. She refilled cups when they were empty, stepped aside when wolves moved through the space without looking at her, and listened with the attentiveness of someone who understood that information was the only currency available to those with no other kind of power. She learned, in the first hour of the reception, that the binding ceremony was scheduled for 3 days hence, that Elder Soren had reservations about the timing expressed only in the tightness of his jaw, that Isolde's younger brother Fenric was drinking more than the occasion warranted, and watching his sister with an expression that might have been concern or something more complicated, and that Calum Draven had not smiled once since his arrival, and seemed to be processing the reception with the same focused, cataloging attention that Serena used, taking in information without being moved by any of it. She was reaching across a table to retrieve an empty cup when she heard Isolde's voice behind her, low and sharp the way it got when Isolde wanted something and was encountering an obstacle. "The Relics Hall is not part of the tour," Isolde was saying. "My father has approved the guest. Rooms, the ceremonial courtyard, and the war chamber." The Alpha King expressed interest in the historical collection, said a voice Serena did not recognize. "It is a significant collection by all accounts. It is also a working archive," Isolde said, with the smooth authority of someone exercising a veto while pretending to offer information. "Many items require specialist care, perhaps after the ceremony." There was a pause in which Serena very carefully did not look up from her task. "Of course," said the voice. "I will let the Alpha King know of the restriction." Isolde's tone shifted to something warmer. "It is not a restriction, simply a practicality." Another pause. "I will pass that along as well." Serena set the cup on her tray and moved away from the table. She was thinking about the inscription glowing at the base of the wolf's dais. She was thinking about Isolde declining to allow the Alpha King access to the Hall of Relics. Isolde was not a woman who acted without reason, and her reasons were rarely simple and never accidental. By the time Serena had deposited her tray in the service corridor, she had constructed 3 possible explanations for the restriction, and only one of them was innocent. She chose, as she always chose, to proceed as though she knew nothing, while her mind worked the problem with patient, thorough attention. The first night of the delegation's stay passed without incident. Serena completed her evening duties, returned the Hall of Relics to its closed and secured state, verified that the inscription at the wolf's base was no longer visible, which it was not. The glow had faded sometime during the day, and the surface of the dais looked as it always looked, smooth and undifferentiated and ancient, and made her way to the small room in the household staff quarters that had been hers since she was old enough to be moved out of the nursery the clan had grudgingly maintained for her during her early childhood. The room was exactly large enough for a bed, a narrow wardrobe, a desk, and a single window that looked out over the northern courtyard. She had decorated it over the years with things she had found or been given, or, very occasionally, saved carefully to purchase, small pressed northern flowers, mounted in a frame of river-smoothed wood, a sketch of the stronghold in winter that a visiting human artist had given her after she helped him navigate the protocol for requesting archival access, a single shelf of books that represented the collected intellectual inheritance of her father's library after his death, the clan having determined that the books held no monetary value and could therefore be left to her. It was a small life in a small room, and she had made her peace with it years ago, and she was lying on her bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about a glowing inscription in a language older than the current ruling system, and wondering what blood of the lost line meant when someone knocked at her door. She opened it to find Elder Soren standing in the corridor with his hands folded in front of him, and the expression of a man who had decided to do something and was executing the decision with minimal ceremony. "May I come in?" he said, which was technically a question and functionally a statement. Serena stepped back from the door. He entered the room, looked around it once with the quick, comprehensive attention of someone assessing information, and then turned to face her. "You are Serena Voss," he said, adopted daughter of archivist Tobias Voss, deceased. Human, by all official clan records. He said human the way someone might say a species designation in a biological text, not unkindly, simply precisely. "Yes," Serena said. He looked at her for a long moment with eyes that she now recognized, looking more closely, as gold, rather than the gray she had assumed from a distance. Old gold, the color of autumn leaves at their peak. The Alpha King would like to see the Hall of Relics tonight, he said, quietly, without an official escort. Serena held his gaze with the steady calm that was her default setting and said nothing. "Isolde Garrick has restricted access," Soren continued, in a tone that made clear he was aware of this, and considered it information rather than an obstacle. "However, the Hall of Relics falls under the administrative purview of the archival household staff, specifically of the senior keeper of relics." He paused. "Which is, I understand, a position currently held by you." "I am the only keeper of relics," Serena said carefully. "It is not a prestigious position." "No," Soren agreed, "but it is a position with keys." He said this without any particular emphasis. He did not need to. Serena looked at him for another long moment, and thought about the inscription, and thought about Isolde's careful restriction, and thought about the fact that Elder Soren was not a man who did things without reason, any more than Isolde was. "When?" she said finally. "An hour after the stronghold bells mark the second watch," he said. He moved toward the door, paused with his hand on the frame, and looked back at her with an expression she could not fully categorize. "The Alpha King is not what people expect him to be," he said. It was not advice, and it was not a warning. It was simply something he had chosen to say. Then he was gone. Serena lay back down on her bed and stared at the ceiling for approximately 40 minutes. Then she got up, put on her boots, retrieved the keyring from her wardrobe, and went to wait in the Hall of Relics. He arrived without sound. She had been standing near the central dais, facing the wolf and not touching it, when the door opened behind her, and he came in, and the first thing she noticed, before she turned, was the change in the air. It was a wolf thing, that quality of presence that the most powerful ones carried. A pressure change in the atmosphere, a subtle signal that the top of the hierarchy had entered the space. She was sensitive to it from long exposure, the way anyone became sensitive to the sounds of an environment they had lived in for years. She turned and found him standing just inside the closed door, alone, without his guards, in a plain dark tunic and trousers that he wore with the easy authority of someone who understood that he did not require his formal clothing to establish what he was. His pale eyes found her immediately, and she had the very specific experience of being looked at rather than looked past, which was unusual enough that she registered it consciously. "You are the keeper," he said. His voice was lower than it had been during the formal greeting in the main hall. Not softer exactly, simply more direct, without the layer of public performance. "Yes," she said. "Alpha King." She inclined her head in the acknowledgement that protocol required. He crossed the room toward the central dais with the same quality of contained, deliberate motion she had observed during his arrival, and stopped in front of the wolf. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. Serena stood to the side, and slightly behind him, and let him look. She had found, in her years of managing visiting scholars and occasional dignitaries who had somehow navigated their way into the archival halls, that people revealed more in their silences than in their questions, and she had learned to read those silences carefully. What she read in his was harder to interpret than most. He was not performing reverence, which some visitors did, treating the hall as a kind of theater for the demonstration of cultural appreciation. He was not performing indifference either, which others did, particularly those who felt that demonstrating emotion about historical objects was below their dignity. He was simply looking at the wolf with an attention that felt genuine and thorough, the way Serena herself looked at things she was trying to understand. "It does not melt," he said. Finally. "No," Serena agreed. "It has never melted. In the time it has been here, which the scholars estimate at over a millennium, there is no record of any change in its physical composition. And no one can touch it," he said. It was not quite a question. "Members of the clan find contact with the surface painful," she said, choosing her words with the care she always used when she was not certain how much to reveal. "A burning cold, not dangerous with brief exposure, but unpleasant enough to discourage sustained contact." He was quiet for a moment. "And you," he said. He was still looking at the wolf, not at her. "You are not a member of the clan, not a wolf." "No," she said. "I am human." "Can you touch it?" he said. Still not quite a question. The pause before she answered was 2 seconds, which was 1 second more than she had intended. "Yes," she said. His head turned then, slowly, and he looked at her directly, and she met his gaze with the steadiness she had been, cultivating since childhood, because it was either that or be devoured by her own anxiety, and for a moment, neither of them said anything at all. "Show me," he said. "What do you think will happen next? Leave your predictions in the comments below." She stepped forward and placed her palm flat against the wolf's flank. The cold moved through her in its familiar greeting, and then, because it had apparently decided that yesterday was not enough, and that whatever it had begun, it intended to continue. The wolf's pale eyes began to glow again, slower this time, more deliberate, the blue light moving through the carved body and settling into the base of the dais, and pooling there until the inscription became visible again, every character sharp and clear against the cold light. She heard Calum draw a breath beside her. She did not look at him. She kept her hand against the wolf and let the inscription be read by whoever was going to read it, because it was becoming clearer to her by the moment that whatever the wolf intended, it did not intend to remain her secret. "Read it to me," he said. His voice had changed. Not dramatically. Not in the way that voices changed in stories when people encountered the supernatural and became overwhelmed with feeling. But there was a quality in it now that had not been there before. Something that was not quite uncertainty but was in the vicinity of it. The sound of a man who has organized his world around a set of reliable certainties and is encountering something that does not fit the system. Serena read him the inscription. She read it slowly and clearly, the way she read everything, with the attention to precision that years of working with archival materials had built into her habits. When she finished, the silence in the hall was the deep particular kind that follows significant information, the kind that has weight and texture. Blood of the lost line, he said finally. What lost line? I do not know, she said, which was honest as far as it went. The inscription appeared this morning. I had never seen it before. You had never seen it. The wolf has never exhibited any behavior before today, she said. In 23 years, it has stood as you see it now, unchanged. No light, no inscription. This began this morning when I touched it. He was quiet for another long moment. Then he said, with the directness she was beginning to understand was his default mode, Isolde Garrick restricted access to this hall. Specifically, she did not restrict any other archive space or ceremonial area. Why would she do that? It was absolutely a question, despite the syntax. Serena considered it carefully. She may have reasons I am not aware of, she said. She may have been here herself recently, she said, more carefully still. And she may have seen or found something that she did not want others to see. Another silence. The inscription, he said. Yes, Serena said. Possibly the inscription. He turned to Bai. Look at the glowing base of the dais again. And she watched him read it, his pale eyes moving across the characters with the focused attention of someone who was taking the words seriously, rather than processing them as curiosity. This says the bond was written before the first Alpha drew breath, he said. That is a claim about the mate bond. The founding bond. The one the old texts say was the original sacred pairing at the beginning of the pack system. Yes, Serena said. That is what it appears to reference. He looked at her again. In the cold blue light of the inscription, his pale eyes looked almost colorless, almost glacial, and she thought with the abstract part of her mind that runs parallel to everything else that he and the wolf shared a certain quality of ancient, contained power. And the hand that wakes the guardian, he said. That is you. The wolf responded to my touch, she said. It has always responded to my touch. That is all I know with certainty. What do you know with uncertainty? He said. She took a breath. She told him about the inscription's morning appearance. She told him about the pulse she had felt, the sense of recognition. She did not tell him about the warm feeling that had settled in her chest, because that felt too private and too uncertain, and she had survived this long by revealing only what was necessary, and nothing more. He listened with the quality of attention that she had only ever encountered in two other people in her life. Her adoptive father, who had listened to everything she said as though it might be important, and the wolf, which had always seemed to her to be attending to her presence in a way that she could not rationally explain. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said something she had not expected. I have been told all my life that the mate bond is a myth, he said. That the pairing the old texts describe was a metaphor for political alliance, not a literal supernatural connection. Every elder in my council believes this. And you, she said, because his phrasing had been very deliberate about what others believed and not about what he did. He looked at the wolf again. I am a king, he said. I make decisions based on evidence. He paused. I am looking at evidence. She found him, 3 days later, in the east corridor near the garden entrance at a time when the stronghold was quiet and most of the household staff were either at their midday meal or occupied with preparations for the binding ceremony. She did not find him by searching. She found him because she was walking toward the garden to retrieve a bundle of frost herbs that one of the kitchen staff had asked her to collect. And he was standing at the corridor window, looking out at the snow, with the particular quality of stillness that she had come to recognize as his thinking posture, the contained, focused inward attention of someone working through a problem that does not have an easy solution. She could have passed without stopping. She had passed important people in corridors for 23 years by making herself unremarkable and continuing at her normal pace. She stopped anyway. She was not sure why, afterward, when she tried to reconstruct the decision. She stood beside him at the window and looked out at the snow. And for a moment, neither of them said anything. And the silence between them was not uncomfortable, which surprised her, because she found most silences, with people she did not know well, to be work. "You did not tell anyone about the inscription," he said, without looking at her. "No," she said. "Why?" he said. She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Because I did not yet understand what it meant," she said, "and because premature disclosure of incomplete information causes more problems than it solves." He was quiet for a moment. "That is a very careful way of thinking," he said. "Yes," she said simply. He glanced at her. Then, sideways, briefly, and she caught the edge of an expression she had not seen on him before. Something that was not quite amusement, but was in its neighborhood. "Isolde's staff have been in the Hall of Relics twice in the past 2 days," he said. "I know," she said. "I keep an inventory log. Several items were moved." "Were they returned?" "Yes," she said. "Everything was replaced exactly. Very carefully." She paused. "She is very thorough." "She is," he agreed. "What was she looking for?" "I believe she was looking for the inscription," Serena said. "I believe she has seen it before, perhaps weeks or months ago, and she has been trying to determine if it was still visible." She looked out at the snow. "It was not visible when her staff came. It only appears when I make contact with the wolf." Another brief glance from him. "And you have been making contact with the wolf every morning for 23 years, he said. "Yes. And it began showing the inscription yesterday." "Morning? The morning of your arrival," she said, because that fact had been sitting in the back of her mind since the beginning, and she thought it was time to say it out loud. He was quiet for a long time. The snow outside was the dense, heavy kind that falls without wind, each flake taking its time, the whole world muffled and white and patient. "Tell me about your father," he said. "My adoptive father," she said. "Yes," he said. "I know he was the archivist. I know he died 4 years ago. Tell me something else." She thought about Tobias Voss, his careful hands and his precise mind, and the way he had looked at her sometimes with an expression she had never been able to fully read, something that was love and grief, and a kind of protective apology all at once. "He never told me who my parents were," she said. "He said he had found me. He said he had been asked to care for me by someone he trusted. He would not say who." "Found you where?" he said. "He said in the snow," she said. "A night of heavy storm. He said I was wrapped in something he described as cloth, that was not quite cloth, smooth and cold and slightly blue. I always assumed that was the cold in his memory." She paused. "Now I am less certain." He said nothing, but she felt his attention shift, a quality of focus that was almost tangible. "He kept notes," she said. "He was an archivist. He kept notes on everything. When he died, the clan determined his personal papers were of no interest and left them to me, along with his books." She paused again. "I have not read all of them." This was technically true. She had read perhaps 2/3 of them, the parts that discussed historical records and archival methods and occasional personal observations about his work. She had not read the sealed portion, the thick package at the back of the box that had been bound with cord and sealed with wax, that bore an imprint she had recognized as very old, but had never been able to identify. She admitted to herself now, standing in this corridor beside the most powerful man in the Northern Territories, a little afraid of what it might contain. "Read them," he said. It was not a command, exactly, but it was not a command. She looked at him directly, which she had been doing more over the past 3 days than she usually looked at anyone, because most people made her feel the need to manage her gaze carefully, to avoid the perception of challenge or intimacy. But he seemed to be Someone who responded to directness the way she responded to it, as respect rather than aggression. "Tonight," she said. He nodded once. Then he looked back out at the snow. The sealed package contained 14 sheets of paper covered in Tobias Voss's careful, close handwriting, and a smaller folded piece of something that was not quite paper, smooth and slightly blue and cold to the touch, even after all the years it had been sealed away. Serena sat at her desk and read every word. It took her 2 hours. When she was done, she sat very still and looked at the piece of not quite paper and the small symbol pressed into it that she now recognized as the seal of a bloodline, recorded in the archival texts as extinct for 3 generations. The Voss line was not her real name. Her real name was written in the last page of the notes in her father's hand, with a tenderness she could feel through the letters, as though he had written it knowing it would be the last thing she learned about herself, and wanting it to feel like a gift. Serena Solvane, the Solvane bloodline, the lost line of the Glacier Keepers, the ancient family that had been the original guardians of the Ice Wolf before the Boreal clan had taken the stronghold and absorbed, or in some cases eliminated, the previous inhabitants. The last known Solvane had reportedly died in the transition. Reportedly. Apparently not. She pressed the not quite paper between her palms and felt it warm slightly at her touch the way the wolf warmed, not melting, simply becoming willing to be held. She thought about 23 years of touching the wolf every morning. She thought about the inscription and blood of the lost line and the guardian choosing its queen before the king knew her name. She thought about the binding ceremony 2 days away, about Isolde Garrick, who had very likely found this information weeks ago and been ensuring no one else found it before the ceremony made it irrelevant. She thought about Calum, Draven at a corridor window watching snow. Then she blew out her lamp and sat in the dark and thought about what to do next. What she did next was go to bed, sleep with the specific, deliberate intentionality of someone who understands that they need a clear mind in the morning, and wake at the hour before dawn when the stronghold was at its quietest, and make her way to the Hall of Relics. She touched the wolf. The glow came immediately this time, faster and brighter than before, as though the wolf had been waiting, as though it had things to say that it had been storing up. The inscription was there, and beneath it, newly visible, additional lines she had not seen before, a continuation she had not known to look for. She crouched close and read them carefully, moved her lips slightly the way she did when she was working through difficult archaic syntax, and when she had parsed them completely, she sat back on her heels and looked at the full inscription in its entirety, and understood that what she was looking at was not a prophecy in the passive sense, not a description of events that would happen or had happened, but something more like a mechanism, a set of conditions, and a consequence. If the hand of the lost blood wakes the guardian and the guardian chooses, the bond between the chosen and the one who carries the glacial throne claim is sealed not by ceremony but by recognition. No human ceremony supersedes it. No political arrangement alters it. The bond precedes all other bonds and survives them. Serena read that last line twice. The bond precedes all other bonds and survives them. She thought about the binding ceremony in 2 days. She thought about what bond means in a world where wolves mate for life, and the old texts described the original mate bond as the most fundamental supernatural law of the pack system. She thought about what it meant that the inscription said the bond was sealed not by ceremony but by recognition, and she thought about the moment. In this very room 3 days ago, when Calum Draven had walked through the door and the air had changed, and she had been so focused on managing her response to his presence that she had not stopped to examine what that change had actually felt like, which was, she admitted now, sitting on the cold floor of the Hall of Relics with the wolf glowing above her and the pre-dawn silence all around, something very much like recognition. She needed to tell him. She had spent 23 years managing. Her own problems alone had developed the habit of self-containment to such a degree that trusting anyone else with information this significant felt almost physically uncomfortable. But she thought about the sealed papers and the not-quite paper with the Solvane seal, and the inscription growing with each passing day, and about Isolde who knew enough to be dangerous, and about a binding ceremony 2 days away that would seal a political alliance on the basis of false pretense. She had spent 23 years inside this clan as a human in a wolf's world, which meant she had spent 23 years understanding, more clearly than anyone around her, the difference between the structures people built to organize power and the actual substance of what power was. And she understood, with a clarity that felt like cold water and felt like the wolf's pulse in her palm, that what she had found was not a small thing. It was the kind of thing that, if suppressed, would hollow out. Everything built on top of it. If she said nothing, the binding ceremony would happen. An alliance would be made, and a lie at its foundation would eventually crack it open. If you want to see how this story ends, make sure you are subscribed with notifications on. She found Elder Soren at breakfast and presented herself at the entrance to the senior staff dining room in the way she had perfected over years. Visible enough to be seen, composed enough to communicate deliberateness rather than intrusion. Soren looked up from his tea and gestured to the seat across from him. She sat and put the not-quite paper on the table between them. He looked at it without touching it, then looked at her. "How much do you know?" he said. "Enough," she said. "And how much do you know?" he said, with an inflection that made clear he was asking whether she knew what he knew specifically. She took a breath. "I know about the Solvane bloodline," she said. "I know about the original guardianship of the wolf. I know my father was asked to hide me by someone who understood that my existence was dangerous, and I believe I know by whom, though I am not certain. Tobias came to me," Soren said simply. 30 years ago, before you were born. He came to me and he said there was a child of the Solvane line who needed to be hidden, and he asked me if I would help him arrange it. He looked at the not-quite paper. I arranged it. Tobias took you in as his own. I told no one." He paused. "Including the Alpha King." "Why?" she said. "Because the information was not ready," he said, with the precision of a man who had spent a lifetime timing the release of difficult truths. "Because the world was not in a position where knowing it would have produced a good outcome rather than a dangerous one." He looked at her steadily. "And because I did not know whether you would be what you needed to be. And now," she said, "now you are here, at this table, which means the wolf has spoken," he said. "And now the binding ceremony is in 2 days, which means we are out of time for the comfortable approach." He picked up his tea with the steady hands of someone who had been preparing for this conversation, in one form or another, for 30 years. "Tell me what the inscription says," he said. She told him. She told him all of it, including the newest lines she had read that morning, and he listened with his hands wrapped around his cup, and his expression very still and very focused. And when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "The bond precedes all other bonds and survives them," he said, repeating the last line back to her in the way she did herself when she needed to hear something out loud to fully process it. "Yes," she said. "That is what it says." "Then we cannot wait until after the ceremony," he said. "No," she agreed. "We cannot." He set down his cup. "The Alpha King is conducting his morning review of the Eastern Patrol reports until the 8th hour," he said. "He takes his midday meal alone, in the Southern study." He looked at her across the table. "He prefers people who say exactly what they mean," he said. "He has very little patience for the indirect approach." "I have noticed," she said. The briefest shift in his expression, something that was almost warmth. "I imagine you have," he said. She knocked on the door of the Southern study at the hour between morning review and midday meal. He said come in without asking who it was, which was either supreme confidence or habit or both, and she entered and found him at the desk with maps spread in front of him and a cup of something that had gone cold at his elbow. He looked up, and his expression shifted through several things quickly, none of which she could fully name, and then settled into the focused attention she had come to recognize as his way of signaling that he was listening. She closed the door. She put the not-quite paper on the desk in front of him with the Solvane seal facing up. She watched him look at it, watched him recognize something in it, watched his jaw tighten slightly in the way it did when information was landing with weight. "Sit down," he said. She sat. "Tell me what I am looking at," he said, and she told him everything. He did not interrupt her once. He sat with his hands flat on the desk, and his pale eyes steady on her face, and listened to all of it, the papers, the bloodline, the inscription in full, including the newest lines. Soren's confirmation, the Solvane guardianship, the full implication of what bond precedes all other bonds and survives them, meant relative to a binding ceremony 48 hours away. When she finished, the silence was the deep pressurized kind that exists before a significant decision. "Isolde knows," he said. "Some of it," Serena said. "I believe she found the original inscription, before the wolf showed me the rest of it. I believe she has been managing the information to prevent it from affecting the binding ceremony." She paused. "She may not know the full content of my father's papers. She may not know the extent of the Solvane claim." He was quiet. "If she does know," he said, "she would have decided that proceeding with the ceremony before you could be identified or could make any claim was the most efficient solution," Serena said. "Yes," he said. Another silence. He stood, which changed the geometry of the room, and moved to the window and looked out at the stronghold courtyard below with his hands clasped behind him in the posture she had learned to read, as him organizing his thoughts. "I came here to make a political alliance," he said. "A strategic one. The Boreal clan holds the northern pass routes. Control of those routes matters for the next phase of territorial management across the northern territories." He paused. "None of that changes with what you have told me." "No," she agreed. "What changes," he said, still looking out the window, "is the grounds on which a meaningful alliance can actually be made." He was quiet for another moment. "I need two things from you," he said. "I need access to the rest of the inscription, whatever the wolf has yet to show us. And I need a day to think." She looked at his back, the broad set of his shoulders, the stillness of him against the gray winter light from the window. "You have a day," she said. "The binding ceremony is in 48 hours. He turned from the window and looked at her, and there was something in his face that was different from anything she had seen there before. Not the contained authority, and not the working attention, and not the edge of something that might be amusement. Something that was more open than any of those things, and more complicated, and that looked, despite all logic and circumstance, uncomfortably like the first stages of trust. "I have a day," he agreed. She stood. She picked up the not-quite paper from the desk. He reached out and stopped her, his fingers closing around her wrist with a gentleness that was at odds with the size of his hand and the force of his presence. "Leave it," he said. She looked down at his hand on her wrist, and then up at his face, and something moved between them in the space of that look, something that had been building in the back of her awareness since the moment he had walked into the Hall of Relics, and the air had changed, and she understood with the part of her that had always been more honest than the rest of her, that it was not going to become smaller by being ignored. She set the not-quite paper back on the desk. She left. The day he had asked for was difficult to move through. Serena managed it by focusing on tasks, of which there were many as the stronghold prepared for a binding ceremony. She polished ceremonial artifacts, triple-checked ritual placements, assisted in the kitchen, and managed the small organizational crises that arose in any large household running at high ceremonial capacity. She did all of this with the surface calm that was her most reliable performance, while beneath it, her mind turned over everything she knew and felt. The pulse of the wolf in her palm, the inscription in the ice, the way his fingers had felt on her wrist, gentle and certain at once, as though touching her was something he was allowing himself carefully and intentionally. Isolde found her in the relics hall at the end of the afternoon, alone, which was how Isolde preferred to have conversations that she did not want witnessed. She came in with the particular quality of graceful purpose that she wore in all situations, and she closed the door, and she looked at Serena with the amber eyes that Serena had spent 23 years learning to read, and she said, "We should talk." "We rarely talk," Serena said. She was polishing a ceremonial blade, which gave her hands something to do, and her eyes something to stay on that was not Isolde's face. "We are talking now," Isolde said. She moved toward the central dais with the measured step of someone who knew exactly where they were going, and she stopped in front of the wolf and looked at it for a moment. "I need you to understand something," she said. "This alliance is important, not just for my family, for the clan, for all the northern clans. Calum Draven has more power concentrated in his position than any Alpha King in 200 years. An alliance with him gives the Boreal clan a stability it has not had in my lifetime." She paused. "I know about the Solvane inscription." Serena continued polishing the blade. "I know what it says," Isolde said. "Or what it appears to say. Ancient texts require interpretation. Context." Her voice was very careful. "A 1,000-year-old inscription in a language most scholars cannot read is not a legal document. It is not binding under any current law or custom." Serena set down the blade. She looked at Isolde. "It says the bond precedes all other bonds and survives them," she said. "That is a direct statement." "It is a metaphor," Isolde said. Her voice had acquired a slight edge, the kind that appeared when the graceful surface was under pressure. "For the importance of original lineage in establishing alliance." "That is a very convenient interpretation," Serena said. Isolde was quiet for a moment. "I know what you are," she said, and the directness of it after the careful dancing of the previous sentences was almost refreshing. "I know the Solvane claim. I have known for 3 months. I have been managing it." She looked at Serena with something that was not kindness, but was at least honesty. "I am not asking you to deny it. I am asking you to let it be private. There is no place in the current structure of the Northern Territories for an ancient bloodline claim that has no surviving political infrastructure. You have no pack. You have no clan. You have no army. You have a carving in a glacier and a dead man's papers. Against that, I have a living clan and a real alliance and a real future for my people." She paused. "What exactly do you think you can offer him that is worth throwing all of that away?" Serena looked at her for a long time. She thought about 23 years of invisibility and the specific wisdom it produced. She thought about what Isolde was offering, which was, in its own way, a real political argument. She thought about what the wolf had been building toward with its inscription, line by line, day by day, as though it was not delivering a message all at once, but allowing the recipient time to grow large enough to hold it. "The truth," she said. "I can offer him the truth." Isolde looked at her with the amber eyes that were suddenly very tired. "The truth," she said, "does not build alliances." "No," Serena agreed, "but it is what has to be built on." Isolde looked at her for another moment. Then she turned and left the room without another word, which was, Serena knew, a kind of answer. She went to the Hall of Relics. At midnight, she finished the evening tasks and walked the path back to the household staff quarters, and then kept walking, through the corridor that ran along the back of the stronghold's interior, and to the Hall of Relics. She crossed to the dais and put her hand on the wolf and waited to see if there was more to read. There was. The inscription had grown again, extending down the far side of the base in text she had not yet seen, and she moved around the dais to read it, crouching in the blue light. This portion was different from the others, less declarative, more direct. It was addressed. "The Guardian speaks to the blood of its keeping. You have carried the cold of our covenant your whole life and called it solitude. You have read every record of what came before and never found your own name in the pages, because those who loved you were protecting you from the knowledge that comes with it. The time of protection is over. The time of claiming is here. You were never invisible. You were waiting. Serena read those lines 3 times. The 3rd time, her eyes were burning in the way they did when she was holding very still against something that wanted to move. She pressed her forehead lightly against the wolf's flank and let the cold move through her for a moment, the way she imagined it might feel to rest. You were never invisible, she said aloud quietly, because the hall was empty and the wolf was listening. You were waiting. The wolf's eyes pulsed once, warm and blue and ancient. Behind her, very quietly, the door opened. She did not turn immediately. She heard his footsteps and recognized them, had apparently, she discovered in this moment, memorized them without being aware of doing so. The particular quality of his tread, the weight and the pace, and the controlled deliberateness of it. He came to stand beside her, and he looked at the newest inscription, and he was quiet for a long time, reading. When he finished, he looked at her, at the position of her forehead against the wolf's flank, and she straightened and stepped back and looked at him with the steadiness she would maintain if it was the last thing she managed, because she was not going to perform fragility in front of him or anyone else, not even at midnight in a glowing hall with everything she thought she knew about herself rearranging itself around an ice-carved wolf. You read it, he said. Yes, she said. All of it. The last portion, he said. When did it appear? Now, she said. While I was standing here. He was looking at her with that open, complicated expression she did not know how to name, and it occurred to her, not for the first time, that he was genuinely difficult to read, that whatever he felt he contained with the same discipline she used, and that what was showing on his face right now was what had gotten through the discipline, rather than what was being performed for her benefit. I have been thinking, he said. You said you needed a day. She said. I thought that was tomorrow. I finished thinking tonight, he said. He moved toward the dais and stopped in front of the wolf and looked at it for a moment, then looked back at her. I need to ask you something, and I need a direct answer. I give direct answers, she said. I know, he said. A pause. Do you feel it? He said. The bond that the inscription describes. Do you feel anything that corresponds to it? She held his gaze. This was the question she had been sitting with for 3 days, managing it the way she managed all uncomfortable truths, with the patient, thorough attention of someone who would rather understand something difficult than avoid it. Yes, she said. Since the first night, in this room, when you walked through the door. He breathed in once, slowly. I have felt it since I arrived, he said. I thought it was strategic interest, political attention. I am accustomed to assessing situations and people quickly, and I thought that was what I was doing. He paused. That is not what it is. No, she agreed. It is not what it is. The blue light of the wolf moved gently around the hall, and the silence was the particular warm kind that happens when 2 people have both said something true and are letting it exist between them before anything else happens. He crossed the space between them in the deliberate way he did everything, and he stood close enough that she had to look up slightly to meet his eyes. And she did, because looking away would be a kind of cowardice she did not allow herself. The binding ceremony is in 2 days, he said. Yes, she said. Canceling it will have political consequences, he said. Significant ones. Yes, she said. The Boreal clan needs the alliance, he said. The northern pass routes are strategically important. That does not change. No, she said. So the alliance needs to happen, he said. Simply on different terms than the ones currently scheduled. She was very still. One possibility, she said carefully. "It is the only possibility that the inscription supports," he said, with the directness that was his most consistent quality, and that she had decided she respected more than any other single thing about him. "The bond precedes all other bonds and survives them." He said it as fact, the way he said everything he had decided was fact, without room for negotiation in the statement itself, though she knew by now that he was always open to the evidence beneath. "Idon, I cannot in good conscience bind myself to an arrangement that contradicts a 1,000-year-old supernatural law that is literally inscribed in the guardian of the clan I am forming an alliance with." He paused. That would be bad politics. The corners of his mouth moved in the way she had come to recognize as his version of a smile, small and genuine and rare. Extremely bad politics, she agreed, and felt something ease in her chest that had been held tight since the morning the wolf had first glowed. He reached up and touched her jaw with one hand, gently, with the same deliberate intentionality with which he did everything. And she let herself be still under it. Let herself be seen. Let the cold in her, and the recognition and the 23 years of waiting be exactly what they were. "Your name," he said. "Your real name." "Serena Solvane," she said. He repeated it, not loudly, just to have it in his mouth. "I am going to speak to Soren tonight," he said. "I am going to speak to Alpha Garrick." He dropped his hand. "This is going to be complicated." "Yes," she said. "Are you afraid?" he said. She thought about it honestly. "Of the complication, no," she said. "Of other things, a little." He looked at her steadily. "What things?" "Being wrong about large things that cannot be unchosen," she said. He nodded once, as though this was a reasonable answer, and he had expected nothing less. "I have made large decisions before," he said. "I have never made one that had a glacier testifying in its favor." He looked at the wolf, and the wolf looked back with its pale, glowing eyes, and the inscription shimmered in the ice. "I trust evidence," he said. "And you are the most compelling evidence I have ever encountered." She looked at him and thought about the inscription and the papers, and the not-quite paper with the Solvane seal. And she thought about her father writing her name in the last line of 30 years of hidden notes. And she thought about the wolf's words, "You were never invisible. You were waiting." And she decided, with the deliberate intentionality of someone who has given the decision the serious attention it deserves, that she was done waiting. The morning of the intended binding ceremony day began very differently than it was supposed to. Serena was in the Hall of Relics at dawn, which was where she always was, but she was not alone. Calum arrived at the 7th hour with Elder Soren, and they spent an hour examining the full inscription while Serena stood with her palm against the wolf and let the glow remain steady. Soren produced documents from his inner robe, dense archival pages he had apparently been keeping for 30 years against exactly this moment. Records of the Solvane bloodline and the original guardianship covenant, and the specific clause in the founding law that addressed the sacred bond in legally significant terms. He spread them on the floor, because there was no table large enough. And they crouched around them, and the Alpha King of the Northern Territories sat on the floor of a relic hall, with the Guardian glowing above him, and worked through the legal language with the focused, systematic attention of someone who had decided he was going to understand this completely before acting. Serena found herself appreciating him in the 2nd hour of this process, with a specificity distinct from anything she had felt before. The appreciation of watching someone take the time to understand a thing, rather than simply deciding what it was. Alpha Garrick received the Alpha King at the 9th hour. Serena was not present for that conversation. She stood in the corridor outside the council chamber, and listened to the quality of silence from within, which told her more than words would have. There was a long initial period of controlled, muffled speech that suggested the kind of measured political negotiation that Calum conducted, she now understood, by being very clear about what he knew and what he intended, and leaving space for the other party to respond with dignity. Then there was a period of louder, less controlled speech from one voice that she recognized as Garrick's, which was the sound of someone whose planning had been disrupted and who was processing that disruption in real time. Then a longer period of quiet again, punctuated by occasional short statements from what sounded like Elder Soren. Then silence. Then the door opened. Alpha Garrick emerged. First, and he looked at Serena in the corridor with an expression she had not seen him direct at her in 23 years, complex and weighed, and carrying something that was not quite guilt, but was in its territory. "You should have told us," he said. And she understood that he meant her father should have, and that Garrick's complaint was as much with himself as with anyone, for not having looked more carefully at what was in his own hall. "My father made the choices he thought were safest," she said. He was right, for the time he made them. Garrick looked at her for another moment, and then he looked at the wolf, visible through the open doors of the relics hall at the end of the corridor, glowing steadily in the morning light. "It has never done that before," he said. "No," she said. "Only now." He made a sound that might have been acknowledgement, and walked away down the corridor with the heavy step of a man carrying a revised understanding of his own history. Calum came out. After him, with Soren behind, and he looked at her in the corridor and said, "There will be a ceremony." She looked at him. "Not a binding ceremony," he clarified. "A recognition ceremony. There is a distinction in the founding law texts. Soren found it." He paused. "It is, in fact, the original ceremony, the one the founding law was written to accommodate, which the binding ceremony was designed to replace." He looked at her with the pale eyes that the morning light made look almost silver. "It requires the guardian to bear witness," he said, "which means it has to happen in the Hall of Relics." "In front of the wolf," she said. "In front of the wolf," he agreed. She looked at him and thought about all the things she had spent 23 years being careful about, and all the things she had spent 23 years waiting, without knowing she was waiting. And she thought about the inscription's most recent lines, and the wolf's patient, accumulated certainty. And she said, "When?" "Today," he said. "Now, if you are ready." "I have been ready for a very long time," she said. "I simply did not know it." The ceremony was not large. It was witnessed by Elder Soren, who stood with the particular stillness of someone fulfilling a purpose 30 years in the making. It was witnessed by Alpha Garrick, who stood with the expression of a man renegotiating his relationship with history. It was witnessed by Fenric, Isolde's younger brother, who had come because Soren had sent for him, and who looked at Serena with the open, uncomplicated expression of someone who had suspected for years that something was not as it appeared, and was relieved to be proven right. And it was witnessed by the wolf, which stood in its cold ancient light with its pale glowing eyes, and which had, Serena understood, been waiting for this moment in the particular patient way that things made of glacier ice can wait, by simply remaining exactly what they are through every storm and season until the world is finally ready to see them clearly. Calum stood in front of her, and he took both her hands in his, which were cold. Her hands were always cold, and he felt it, and looked down at her hands, and then at her face, and something moved across his expression that was the opposite of composed, open and warm, and entirely unmanaged, and she understood that this was what he looked like when he was not performing anything for anyone. "The founding law states that recognition must be spoken, Elder," Soren said, from somewhere behind them. "It must be witnessed by the guardian, and by members of all parties involved in the original covenant. It must be freely given." Calum looked at Serena. "Freely given," she said. His hands tightened on hers, just slightly, with the particular deliberateness of someone making a choice rather than being carried by circumstance. Then he spoke the words that Soren had found in the founding law text, old words, the original language of the pact system before. The common tongue had standardized it, and Serena listened to them and felt them settle into her chest alongside the wolf's pulse and the cold that had lived in her hands for as long as she could remember, and understood that these things had always been different names for the same thing. She spoke the response when it was time, in the same old language, reading from the page Soren held for her, and then, halfway through, no longer needing the page, because the words were familiar in the way her own name in her father's handwriting was familiar. something recognized rather than newly learned. The wolf's glow intensified when the last words were spoken, filling the hall with the cold blue light, and for a moment it was as bright as winter noon in a snowfield, and then it faded slowly back to its usual subtle pulse, and the wolf stood on its dais in the quiet hall, exactly as it always had, carved in ancient glacier ice, unchanged and patient, and present. Isolde was told by her father, privately, that same afternoon. Serena did not know what was said in that conversation, and did not seek to know. What she understood was that Isolde had responded with the controlled grace of someone retreating to a position from which they could determine the next move. She was not warm to Serena in the days that followed, but she was not cruel either, directing her political intelligence toward how the Boreal clan could best navigate the new arrangement. The alliance was renegotiated. The Northern Pass routes remained central to the agreement. The Boreal clan's position was, if anything, more secure under the new terms, because an alliance founded on truth has a structural integrity that one founded on managed information cannot maintain. Serena moved through the next days in a state she kept checking against her experience of normal, because it was unfamiliar enough to require verification. She was still practical and precise, still woke early and went to the Hall of Relics and, pressed her palm against the wolf's flank in greeting. But the smallness was gone. The specific quality of smallness she had maintained for 23 years, the habit of making herself unremarkable, the constant low-level management of the expectation that she would be overlooked. It was gone. Not because anything external had changed overnight, but because the thing that had been waiting in her had finally been given room to be what it was. She was Serena Sylvain. The cold in her veins was not a deficit or a strangeness, but an inheritance, and she had carried it for 23 years without knowing its name, and now she knew its name, and it fit. The formal public recognition happened at the end of the delegation's extended stay, in the great hall of the Boreal stronghold with the full pack assembled. It was not the ceremony that had been planned. It was something older and more real, and Serena stood at the center of it, with the not-quite paper of her bloodline in her hands, and Calum beside her and Elder Soren reading from the founding law text in a voice that had been saving itself for this moment for 30 years. She looked out at the faces of the pack that had tolerated her for 2 decades and saw that some of them had always known there was something they were not quite seeing clearly, and that the knowledge landing now was less surprise than confirmation. Fenric stood near the front and looked relieved. The wolf was not there, physically, but Serena felt its pulse in her chest like a steady second heartbeat, and understood that it did not need to be there, because it was already part of her. When Soren finished reading and the hall was quiet, Calum turned to her in front of everyone and did not perform anything, did not make the moment into political theater or ceremonial display, simply looked at her with the open warmth that was what he looked like when he was not managing his expression for an audience, and said quietly enough that only she could hear, "I told you I trust evidence." "You did," she said. "You are the most compelling evidence I have ever encountered," he said, repeating it from the night in the hall. And she remembered that night, and the cold glow and the inscription, and the way his hand had felt on her wrist, and the decision she had made, deliberate and clear, to stop waiting. "You said that before," she said. "I mean it more now," he said. Behind them, the assembled pack stirred and murmured with the particular sound of a group processing information that will take time to fully settle. And around them, the great hall was full of the complicated business of history rearranging itself around truth. And Serena stood in the middle of all of it, and felt, for the first time in 23 years, exactly the right size. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who loves epic romance. Tell me in the comments, did you see this ending coming? The wolf in the Hall of Relics glowed steadily through the night, as it would glow for years afterward. A cold blue light that the new keepers learned to read as contentment, as the satisfaction of a guardian whose long work is complete. It had held the covenant through a millennium of change, through the transitions of power and the reshaping of clans, and the slow erosion of the old language from daily use. It had waited, with the patience of glacier ice, for the hand that would wake it, and the king who would hear it, and the moment when the world was finally ready to hold the truth it carried. It had found them in the end, not through drama or catastrophe, but through the slow accumulation of ordinary mornings. A woman with cold hands pressing her palm to ancient ice and feeling recognized. A man who trusted evidence learning to trust something older than evidence. A 30-year secret finally given room to breathe. This is how the oldest bonds survive. Not through ceremony alone, but through the patient accumulated choosing, day by day, to remain exactly what you are until the world sees it clearly. The wolf had always known this. It had simply been waiting for Serena to know it too.